Physical Gold Fund presents the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards. Insights and analysis about economics, geopolitics, global finance, and gold. Welcome to part 2 of the latest podcast from the Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards, presented by Physical Gold Fund. So is the implication then that this collapse is really a very special case, or is there anything to draw from it in a larger sense about stock market investment and what can happen from an investor's point of view?
There is. I mean, it's a special case in the sense that, China's stock market is collapsing. This is not happening elsewhere in the world. The European stock indices are doing okay, and Europe's growth seems to be a little bit better. The U.S., the U.S. kind of looks like it peaked last November, not literally peaked. It's reached a few new highs since then, but not very much higher than it was last fall. So the U.S. stock market's kind of going sideways. It's what I call non-directional volatility. So, you have these days it's up 200 points and then down 150 points and then up 90 and down 80. But if you look at a chart of the S&P and the Dow Jones, they're just kind of wiggling sideways with a lot of volatility. And job creation seems to have slowed down. A lot of things have slowed down. So it looks like the U.S. is not quite in a recession, but we're close to one, and growth kind of really hit a wall, as did the stock market, last fall, late last year. So I don't see the bubble crash dynamic in other major stock markets that I do in China. China seems to be unique in that case. But what I look at is the interconnectedness, what I call the density function, or the potential for either, what's called contagion, or what the IMF calls spillover effects. What are the odds that a crisis in one country spills over and causes a crisis in another country? And that's always a potential. It's always a problem. It's something I look at very closely. So far, the Greece thing seems to have been contained to Europe, and not too much damage was done to capital markets. Obviously, this is extremely painful for the people in Greece. They're having to sacrifice, and their pensions are being cut, and their unit labor costs are going down, wages are going down, unemployment's going up. There are a lot of problems inside Greece, although that could bottom and turn around pretty quickly once they get their banks reopened and get access to capital, and maybe some Chinese capital comes in. So you might look for a turnaround in Greece, but there was no real contagion there, although I think there would have been if somehow Greece had left the euro. And the China thing also does seem to be unique to China. So neither one of those crises, either Greece or China, you go back a week ago Wednesday, we had that awful sequence of events, actually 8 days ago, when it looked like Greece was collapsing, China was collapsing, and the New York Stock Exchange was closed for some software problems, all at the same time that Wednesday afternoon, 8 days ago. So all three of those things seem to be, two of them are behind us, Greece and the New York Stock Exchange closing in China. I think markets have absorbed that. So these don't look like the kinds of things that will set the world on fire, if you will, or start the global contagion. But they are warnings of how unstable a lot of things are. And I always say that the thing that will cause a global panic is the thing we don't expect. In other words, you could sort of see the Chinese thing coming. I talked about it on television last year in 2014. I may have been early, that's fine, but you could see it coming a mile away. Greece, we've been talking about for 5 years. So as dangerous as those things were, neither one of them were unexpected. But one reason to own gold, one reason to be prepared and not wait for a crisis, is that when the crisis comes, it'll be something we don't expect, and there won't be time to get ready. The time to get ready is now.
That's the black swan concept. Well, let's just stay with China for a minute. In your first book, Jim, Currency Wars, we read about your participation in a financial war game hosted by the Pentagon. And I understand you've just taken part in a second such war game, along with a handful of pretty elite participants, I see, from the military, the CIA, the Federal Reserve, and so forth. I'd like to ask you about it, but I'm struck by one implication. Clearly, there are people at the highest reaches of government in the United States who are taking very seriously what you have to say. Is that your impression too?
This is being taken very seriously, John. It's a good question. I wish it were taken a little more seriously at the Fed and the Treasury. Now, those senior officials of those agencies are invited to these war games, but the sponsorship and hosting comes from the Department of Defense. So actually, I would give the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and the national security community broadly slightly higher marks than the Fed and the Treasury for thinking about these things as threats to national security. Now, the Fed thinks about, bank risk and financial contagion, and the Treasury thinks about counter-terrorist finance and Iranian sanctions and all that. So they are working on those things, although those things are a little more oriented to the banking system rather than capital markets, which capital markets are different than following the money around the banking system. The Treasury tends to chase money, freeze accounts, interdict funds of bad guys, whether it's drug dealers or terrorists or whatever, and the Fed worries about systemic risk in banks. But neither one of them are thinking as much about financial warfare. Financial war is different than currency wars. Currency wars are an economic phenomena where countries try to steal growth from each other by cheapening their currencies and try to import inflation, export deflation to the other guy. There may be some rough elbows in the arena, but it is a kind of economic competition. That's different from financial warfare, where you actually are using financial weapons to damage your enemy. There, I would point to U.S. sanctions on Russia in Ukraine, and Russia fighting back by joining hands with China, through the BRICS Summit and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and other institutions that they're standing up to basically replicate the Western financial system on their own so they don't have to depend on it and can't be victimized by sanctions. So that's more in the nature of financial warfare. So this new war game you're referring to, so the first one I did, well, I've done a number of them, but the first one ever was done in 2009, and I wrote about that in chapters 1 and 2 of Currency Wars. Interestingly, that war game was sponsored by the Pentagon, specifically Pacific Command was the sponsor of that, and it was conducted by something called the Office of Net Assessment and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. But we did it at the Applied Physics Laboratory just because they have a war room there. That's the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, which is the same place they've been doing the Pluto planetary exploration with this New Horizons spacecraft. So all the pictures you've seen the last few days and the high fives and the cheering from the ground control team for the New Horizons spacecraft that went past Pluto, that's the same place, same lab that we did the war game in 2009, a different building. But it's kind of an interesting place when you go out there. They do a lot of weapons, space exploration, and they do a lot of wargaming for the Pentagon. The most recent one I did was May 8th. It was also sponsored by the Office of Net Assessment and the Secretary of Defense, but we actually did it at the Pentagon, so that was kind of fun to go there. And it was an interesting day because May 8th was VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and the military arranged it to commemorate. It was the 70th anniversary of Victory in Europe, when the Nazis surrendered, and they arranged a flyover of vintage aircraft. So they had all these B-17, B-29, Stratofortresses, and flying boxcars and flying Tigers, and all these World War II vintage aircraft. So it was kind of, striking and touching, and all at the same time to see the flyover. But this war game was different than the one we did in 2009. The one we did in 2009 was global. We had teams from all over the world and it lasted 2 days. This one was 1 day, and it was very specifically focused on China. And a very interesting twist, which was when the U.S. was conducting financial warfare on Iran in 2012 and 2013, before the president announced his détente with Iran, which has now led to this nuclear agreement. Before that happened, we were in a financial war with Iran, and we kicked them out of SWIFT. Now, SWIFT is the agency in Belgium that actually handles all the message traffic for all bank wire transfers in the world. Of course, it's all digital. It runs through a lot of fiber optic cable these days, but whenever any bank moves money anywhere around the world, internationally, it runs through this system. And we kicked Iran out of that system, which meant that they couldn't get paid. They could ship oil in violation of the sanctions, but there was no way to pay them because you literally couldn't move the euros or the Swiss francs or the Japanese yen or the dollars or whatever, any currency that you would want through the payment channels because the message traffic was interdicted at SWIFT. Of course, leave it to Washington bureaucrats to come up with a good piece of jargon for that, so we call that de-swifting. So the United States de-swifted Iran. That's the expression. So in this war game with China involving the South China Sea and a confrontation between the Philippines and China, where the U.S. is actually a treaty ally of the Philippines. If the Philippines gets in a fight, it's not just an option on the part of the United States to come to their aid. We actually have a treaty with them that says we will come to their aid. But what China tries to do is to de-swift the Philippines. So it's sort of turnabout as fair play. So, and the message for the United States, or the lesson for the United States, is, be careful what you wish for. The United States really developed and perfected these financial weapons. But what we are finding is that people don't just sit still and get pushed around by the United States. They're either building their own systems, so there may come a time, in fact, I think there will come a time, when we want to put some financial sanctions on Russia or China or Iran or Turkey or some other country, and it won't mean anything because they will build completely alternate non-dollar systems where they're quite happy trading with each other and paying each other and moving money and not relying on the United States. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that China will take the same tactics we've been using and apply them to our friends. So again, we have the scenario where China goes to the SWIFT board in Brussels and tries to de-SWIFT the Philippines on the grounds that the Philippines is an aggressor in some confrontation in the South China Sea. So interesting stuff. I commend the Pentagon for being forward-leaning and thinking about this. And to kind of go back to your original question, they were very, very serious. And we go into the room, I'm one of the financial experts who are invited. There are people there from CIA and other branches of the intelligence community, people there from the think tanks, Council on Foreign Relations, the people you might expect to be there, Fed and Treasury. But the actual people from the Pentagon who were hosting this were, I'll say they were very, very attentive. They record everything and they do a debriefing book and all that. But I would say that even compared to 2009, this one had a lot more focus, and it does seem to be more on the radar screen. So, I think we can say that the future of warfare is financial warfare, and as if investors didn't have enough to worry about with bank closures and inflation and deflation and contagion and all the rest, you could be collateral damage in a financial war, which will be fought in cyberspace and digitally. So it's another reason actually to have gold, because it's a non-digital asset. It's a physical hard asset that cannot be hacked or erased.
You have been listening to The Gold Chronicles with Jim Rickards, presented by Physical Gold Fund. Recordings can be found at physicalgoldfund.com/podcasts. You can register there for news of upcoming interviews with Jim Rickards and other world-class thinkers.